Hello, welcome back to the podcast, and today the sky is blue. After some particularly cold, biting days, I have come out with my gloves, but this time appear to have two right gloves, so progress from the previous days. Today we are starting our walk in Roughfields, which not everybody knows about. It's not even somewhere that's necessarily marked on a map, but it's an area around Hadfield and Padfield which has had quite a lot of attention shone on it. Not to get too much into the politics, but I think it's an area that's started to become maybe more appreciated by people who live here. It's next to one of the kind of newer housing estates on the edge of Hadfield, but more importantly, it is pretty much next to where the Peak District National Park boundary line is. Something, I guess, that many people who live in this area wouldn't even know what it was, what it looked like, or the fact that they're even on the boundary. So, with the boundary in mind, I wanted to bring along another guest for today's walk. Someone whose job it is to monitor boundaries. Cassa Townsend from CPRE, Campaign to Protect Rural England, who have come up with this amazing boundary walk of the Peak District. But today, Cassa, we are looking at stage 4 of your 20-part walk, is it? There's 20 stages?
20 stages.
And we're looking at the bullet point number 3. We're just taking it micro today. We're not going too crazy, because stage 4 goes from Old Glossop to Greenfield. Yeah?
It does, yep. This isn't a stage that I'm very familiar with, so I'm grateful for your local knowledge, Claire, which is fabulous. I live over in Sheffield, and I grew up in the heart of the Peak District in the Hope Valley, so the centre really of the national park almost, if I'm allowed to say that. And so coming out to the edges of the national park is really interesting, really different, and I think that's one of the big appeals of the Boundary Walk since it was devised and launched in 2017. Growing in popularity, I believe. This is what the membership of the Facebook group tells me, which grows by about 30 people every month-ish.
Yeah.
So, finding less explored areas, not so much the honeypot sites, you might say, which is a great thing, bringing people to different areas, less known walking routes, finding new places. Yeah, it's really, really enjoyable.
I think one of the things that I've really noticed that, I would encourage if you are listening and walking in this particular area. We're starting on Padfield Main Road in Roughfields right now, and we're about to go through a very old turnstile where there's a green circle which marks that we're on the boundary. And it even has signs of public footpath exactly through the muddy track that we're walking on. But I found it really interesting as I've kind of explored, as I've researched over the last 6 months, this idea of this area and what the boundary means. I guess some people don't really kind of know, if I step to the left, I'm out the boundary. If I step to the right, I'm in the boundary. It's not the hokey cokey. Do you know what I mean? And I suppose there's almost this transition between the boundaries, something that I'm hoping to speak with another couple of artists who've spent the last 5 years working on this stretch of the boundary for one of their projects. We've got cars reversing and moving all around at the moment.
I really want to find out what this group are and whether they're
What are they up to?
Can I go and ask them?
Let's go. I'll tell you what, we're just going to pause our chat. Who are you? What have you been up to? Where have you been walking today?
Oh, no idea, we just follow our leader.
Who's
along Longdendale Trail.
along the trail?
Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Did you know that this is the boundary of the Peak District?
Is it? Really? I didn't know that. No.
Ah, see, look, Cassa is from the CPRE and she has a boundary walk.
Always carrying a book of the Peak District Boundary Walk. Yeah, so that's the greenway marker, but there are lots of other way markers, like you just said, Claire, footpath markers. We are on also the Hadfield and Padfield Heritage Trail right now as well. The Longdendale Trail, which is the old railway line that goes underneath this bridge that we're standing near. Yeah. Or just up there.
Wow.
And how far are you going?
Oh well, we're aiming to go towards a coffee shop. That's what we're doing today. Just over in Tintwistle, because a coffee shop is an important marking point, I've got to say.
Okay.
But how was the trail for you? Did you go all the way down to the Woodhead tunnels?
No, didn't quite get that far.
Next
So
time.
we came along the trails and then we went down by the reservoirs and along the path that runs along by the reservoir and then back up here.
Lovely.
5.5 miles we've done.
Where have you come from?
Where have I come from? Glossop.
Okay, so you're local people.
We're all local.
And you didn't know that this was the Peak District boundary and you got from Glossop.
I
Wow.
didn't know. No,
Wow.
not this bit.
I don't often venture into Hatfield. It's like the Bermuda Triangle for me. I always get lost, even with the sat-nav in Hatfield.
See, and then with the bridge closed right now, even more so.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. We're doing a project called Longdendale Tales, so be sure to have a look.
Oh, really?
Yes. Right, well, we better continue over to the other side, the dark side, as they say. See, I'm from Hadfield, so I shouldn't be associating with you, really, should I?
Absolutely not.
Enjoy.
Have a good day. Yeah.
Right, we're going to go through an old turnstile and then here a gate which says, please close it. Cassa, I'll let you close the gate,
I will.
put the rope over.
Put the rope around, leave gates as we find them.
And actually, as we walk through, there's all like blue confetti on the floor of this kind of muddy field. There is here a very clear fence. I do like kind of observing what's different. You can see here as we enter into the Peak District boundary, you know, if you're walking this area, just notice both sides of the roads. Roughfields, it is just left, you know, brambles left to kind of grow, be what it is. This seems to be much more kind of managed, you know, pasture land. We normally see sheep in this field, for instance. There's a clear kind of, for me, when you actually stop and look, how things look different. And actually we're going to follow a trail of molehills all the way down, as now we can see Bottoms Reservoir and just a little bit of Vale House Reservoir peeking in the distance. So like, I mean, you can see here, Cassa, for something like this, you know, you've got the book here which has brilliant instructions for the boundary walk. It's got things like the maps. If you're not someone who's familiar or confident to read an Ordnance Survey map, then this is great because it's got instructions, it's got pictures, and it's got maps.
It does,
And we are
so-
on page 34,
Page
35.
So yeah, as you said before, stage 4, paragraph 3 we're on, and yeah, you've got written instructions. Now this book, when it was written in the lead up to 2017, launched in 2017, it was a huge volunteer effort. So there was a member of staff at CPRE, Julie Goff. She left and now works for the John Muir Trust, but this was her baby, her brainchild. And she got together a merry band of volunteers. My dad was actually one of them at the time. And lots of different people out walking, recceing the route, writing back in with, well, I think we could go here or we could go there, or if we try and stick to the boundary, we need to go left, but there's actually a higher route that gives you nicer views if you go right. So the whole route was devised on that basis, with people checking the accessibility of the rights of way along the boundary and then writing their own interpretations and then double checking and then in some cases triple checking how that translated and how that might be well understood by people standing with a guidebook.
And you know, it's really interesting as we kind of, you know, put into practice this particular part of stage 4, because where we're kind of walking now, it is following on an OS map, it's a pink kind of dotted line, if you've never noticed that on the map. It's a pink dotted line that we're kind of following, but sometimes you'll find as we go around Bottoms Reservoir, we'll be on that pink dotted line, and other times we'll be slightly off it. And as we get to kind of towards the main valve house gauge basin, the big circly bit that normally has water coming out if you live locally, you'll see that we'll slightly veer off the Peak District boundary. And I think that's kind of quite curious because there'll be many people who come round this area and they will walk the dog and not even notice, you know, that we're on a particular kind of footpath or boundary. And I suppose a big part of what the CPRE does is raising awareness of why we need to protect these green areas.
That's right, yeah. So really the roots of CPRE are nearly 100 years ago now. And what we had in the early 1920s was a bunch of campaigners, people all around the country, but particularly in the Sheffield and Peak District area. So you had Ethel Haythornthwaite, who's a key figure. We might touch on her a little bit as we go through the walk and talk about things. And what she did, what her and her group of contemporaries, campaigners, friends, peers, was to search out the particularly the Peak District boundary in terms of, what to include, how big an area to cover. Why would certain landscapes need protecting? And they certainly did need protecting at that time from urban expansion, from road building, from development. The pressures then are still the pressures now on the countryside. So the boundary itself wasn't ever devised with a walking route in mind. This wasn't, although Ethel and her peers were very much enjoying the countryside and wanting to protect it for that reason, from that point of view. But actually, this was about a boundary in legislation. This was going to be a protected area. So why would certain bits be in and certain bits be out? Which is, an interesting thing to debate and talk about.
I'm just casually, one-handedly climbing a stile and trying not to get caught up in my headphone. It's a skill that I perfected. I think we're going to go right here. You can see a sign here now where it says Public Footpaths, Peak and Northern Footpath Society.
Yeah, the Peak and Northern Footpath Society are a great group. They're a charity as well. That's run by volunteers who take on regionally. So this is the Northern region, and the Peak and Northern region, and they have volunteers who will be out and about monitoring the footpaths, keeping an eye on things, liaising with the relevant authorities to make sure that footpaths and rights of way are accessible. Keeping an eye on signage, raising money to install this wonderful footpath signage that we have. So we're very lucky to have.
Make sure you notice the signs.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one actually. That's nice.
So the Peak District itself only came into being in 1951, and that was pretty much over about 20 years where things really came to a head. There was a committee formed within the government to finally kind of get something in terms of designating what a national park would be, what its role would be. And a big player who was on that committee was Ethel Haythornthwaite, who fundamentally was the person who founded what has become the Campaign to Protect Rural England for Peak District and South Yorkshire nearly 100 years ago. And I've really enjoyed, as part of my research of this project, reading and researching about her, because it's not very often that you kind of hear about these people who almost in some aspects of history have just kind of been really forgotten. And I love the idea of the story of when she was helping kind of campaign for the national parks, that she rode on her horse around what has now become the boundary of the Peak District. Her horse, I'm sure it was called Bracken. Bracken, that's it.
Yeah.
And just imagine this lady in, the 1930s or 40s riding around the Peak District going, that one, that one, that one, that one, then went back, and her second husband, Handley, was a technical planner, so helped her put the map together, and pretty much her on her horse going around the boundary has led to this little kind of walk that we're now doing. If she'd never gone on that ride, I've kind of summed up her story very crudely, but I know that there's a lot more about Ethel Haythornthwaite, including the Ethel Walks, which I have also been doing in my personal time alongside, which is 95 hills or summits around the Peak District, almost like a challenge, to really get you kind of exploring not just the major kind of hills that everybody talks about, but some of the slightly left of centre ones.
Yeah, that's right. So the Ethels were created recently in the last couple of years, and the Ethels app is available to download, and that is really becoming a popular challenge. So ticking off the Ethels,
We've got many around the reservoirs here actually.
Oh, are there?
So
Right,
we've got
okay.
over at Crowden, we've got White Low, we've got Black Hill, which is in the distance. Some people may know the Home Moss mast that you can see sometimes around here. We've got Featherbed Moss, Black Chewhead, which is the border for Greater Manchester,
And
Derbyshire.
You've been ticking these off, haven't you?
Yeah,
Again,
and
it's a way to get out and see places, a destination, a reason to go to a place and have a look and see what's there. not necessarily the most popular places. And I think it's a wonderful tribute to Ethel herself to have her name, Ethel Ready, I think was the name of the app originally.
Yeah.
But her story, going right back to nearly 100 years ago, she was born in the very late 19th century. And what happened to Ethel is that she was engaged and then married at a young age to a chap who went off to fight abroad in the First World War and never returned, which is very sad. So by the age of 22, she was a widow and in grieving, and her family, who were based in Sheffield, and she had a sister as well, very worried about Ethel, and that was the cure for her grief. This was what they encouraged her to do. She was a fan of getting outdoors and being in the countryside, but in her deep grief, that was the cure for her. That was what inspired her eventually to recover from grief, to actually start noticing the pressures and the threats on the countryside back then, from development, from transport, from litter. And that was where the campaigner was born. That she realised she could have an influence in helping to protect these areas, to keep them open and more accessible for people. And that's really where the national park ideas were born, once she was in touch with a whole load of other people who had the same mind. So yeah, a really, really deep and interesting history.
I have to say, it's been one of the highlights of the research in this project, is looking for those kind of stories, and more so, I suppose, also looking for where's the women in the history of walking and the poetry and the art in this area. By the way, we've just turned left, so we're following the path along Bottoms Reservoir now. The water, it's not as still as it usually is today. It's kind of just softly swaying. A lot of people will resonate with Ethel's story, because if you look back at the last few years, lockdown encouraged a lot more people to come out and then use the nature. The RSPB, for instance, have been talking about nature prescription. So, the idea of Ethel almost walking while she grieved, there's a lot of people who can probably... Mental health is something that a lot of people talk about. And I've got to say, for me, this area has been a real kind of just tonic, I think. Over the last few years, I've really faced some quite tough times personally. And what drew me to Ethel's story originally was that I too was grieving. And so I enjoyed walking the hills and this particular area and trying to think of that approach, and finding a different way. And moving, I think, kind of helps you physically and mentally keep moving forwards, because it's easy to get stuck. And that sense, I suppose, with a boundary, like in a more kind of, deeper hippie sense, that there's a sense of change is coming and transition, and that, you can go left or right, past or present. And that, I think, is just to be out and see... we can see the edge of the boundary. It's just over there, and you can see there's lots of buildings and houses, and it's something that's just it brings you back to the present. There's something in that. I mean, with people who are out doing the boundary walks, I imagine, you don't have to be like a serious hiker with all the gear and everything. It could be what we're doing in breaking these stages down to point by point. You don't have to do the whole 20 stages in 3 days or something crazy. It's making these walks manageable and enjoyable for you.
That's it, yeah. Although we did have a lady who completed the whole of the Peak District boundary over the August bank holiday weekend. So in 3 days, and I think it was 19 hours, something like that.
Wow.
Catherine, and she's part of a running group.
Did she sleep?
She had some support from her partner with a van, who came and met her at certain points, and she snatched little bits of sleep.
Wow.
But she is now recorded as the fastest female known time for running the Peak District Boundary Walk. This is a challenge that exists within the running community. There are people who devise their own challenges, and she cottoned on to the Peak District Boundary Walk. I think previously she had completed visiting all of the trig points across the Peak District. So she became aware of the boundary walk, and she turned it into a boundary run.
Yes.
And completed it. Wonderful blog. She has some stuff online on via the Fastest Known Time website, and wonderful photographs, running through rain and, sweat and tears and nighttime, daytime, all the weathers. So yeah, that was an interesting one. But, we do talk a lot about health and well-being, more and more so. We have done for a long, long time, but, you know, more so now. People, since, you know, the pandemic, very much focusing on getting outdoors, getting out of the house when we were finally able to, that kind of thing. Accessing people's local areas more. I think people have genuinely discovered a little bit more about what's on their doorstep.
Well, and hopefully more about, I suppose, the work that you do too, because it's very easy to kind of talk about the legalese of these situations. You know, another housing development is coming, but yes, we need more houses. A bypass may be happening, but people don't want the bypass. It's not right. We've got to protect the countryside. That can sometimes get quite political and, yeah, very technical. But I think as a result of more people kind of walking and looking what's on their doorstep, they start to really appreciate those little kind of hidden bits we can lose if we don't really use them and appreciate them and shout about them.
Yeah, that's right. So there are sometimes byways that you are allowed to access. You do have right of access, the right to roam in certain areas, which, you know, they're not always marked as full public rights of way, but they're either permissive paths or you have a right of access across that land, and you do have to use your eyes. It is very much something I think about when I think about CPRE, because, you know, the campaigning and the protection of the countryside can sometimes, you know, become a little bit political, small p, big P, but in a really sort of non-political, you know, non-pejorative way. I think we would all agree that sort of open air, fresh air, access to the outdoors is something that we all have a right to. So in lots of ways, CPRE has been campaigning for that for many years. And yes, the technical know-how, the ways to work with the development and planning systems in the UK, that's real knowledge. It's difficult work, and we are blessed with many people, professional people and, you know, volunteers who tackle that work and, you know, keep an eye on things. And in a very simple sense, you know, sometimes you're talking about conflicting interests around the countryside. So development, big business, industry versus tourism and the ability of local residents to access, you know, green spaces in the outdoors. But just in the simplest sense, that is a right that we're just continuing to campaign for.
Yeah.
And books like this help, and, you know, just having good signage and having regular use of places like this. The more footprints you see on the ground, for instance, is a reassuring sign. You know, this is a path, this is where people walk. I can do that too, in a really simple way.
Well, you can hear the water's kind of just, if I lean a little bit forward, can you hear a bit of the water? Yeah, it's just kind of coming up the banks towards us, and
It's a lovely sound.
sounds like, are they seagulls in the distance?
They're gulls of some
Gulls,
kind.
yeah.
Yes. I
They're
wouldn't
definitely
like to
going
hazard
pretty
a guess
crazy. Now, I did speak to a couple of anglers who I saw here the other week. Whether they have the licence to be fishing here or not, I cannot say. However, I asked them what fish are here, and they were saying all kinds of different things. Chub, perch, the usual, pike. But when I was kind of looking at the research into this particular patch, as we look out with Bottoms in front of us, in the distance you can start to see the Crowden Quarry, Peak Naze of course, and the Woodhead Pass to our left, and Tintwistle there where we're headed. You know, back in the day before these reservoirs were here in 1847, this particular patch was just the River Etherow. The valley was covered in plum trees. Apparently there was said to be salmon running through the River Etherow at this stage. Yeah, you know, and it's kind of just wild to think of this landscape like that, just a small river kind of running down through here. And, you know, in the distance there would still be mill towns, the Valehouse mill town that was there, which was flooded, which we'll get into in future episodes. But yeah, and even finding the maps, I mean, the people at Tintwistle Parish Council were brilliant in opening their doors to me to show me some of the maps that they have. They kept them from being thrown in a skip. They weren't quite sure what to do with them, but they had maps from 1860s which show, you know, the well, and a lot of the houses we can see on the banks, they weren't built yet. there was huge kind of gaps, and the houses, of course, in Hadfield, a lot of those weren't built until the 1890s. So you can just really imagine how this landscape has changed just over, the last 200 years. And yet here we are, walking the boundary, which was put in place 1951. So it's, I think a lot of people kind of forget as they walk round these routes often, just, if we could transport ourselves back in time, Cassa, we could just go, whoo, flick our fingers and be like, here it is in 1950, here it is in 1900. And, I wonder who would be here. I wonder, would it be kids playing the left of us here? Me and my husband always call this tree roots bit, because there's a little wall where you can climb over, take a little route back up to the top of Padfield Main Road. This actually is a disused quarry site, and there's lots of kind of fascinating things. I've been lucky enough to hang out with a moss scientist over here, and he'd set us a challenge to find 5 different types of moss. I have never looked at moss in my life. So all these things are kind of, here, and I will pin on our map at longdendaletales.co.uk. It's a digital map which has lots of little points along the whole of the Longdendale reservoirs, of points of interest, of poetry, of songs, of pieces of art, of photography, of stories that I've been collecting. I could probably put 1,000 pins on there for all the stories that people have been sending me. But at the moment, this is just a pilot project. But just at the corner where there's a bench just here, if you need to put your feet up, I actually took part in Hadfield Art Show last year in something called a Pro Loco. And the idea of a Pro Loco is that you paint on location. And we had to paint somewhere outdoors within like a 4 or 5 hour time period in Hadfield, and I picked the edge of here to paint the view of Bottoms Reservoir.
Gorgeous. Yeah, just that whole idea of going back in time. I suppose people were still getting away from those things. You would work a long week, you would have things to do, keep you busy, family life, work life, industry, but you would get out and walk. And really, this might be another whole other subject to explore entirely, but thinking about the mass trespassers, 1932, people that were
the Kinder Scout.
For the Kinder Mass Trespass, yeah. So people staking a claim, making a statement. We have the right to these moors. We are Sheffield, we are Manchester. These urban areas, people needed the health and well-being benefits of getting out into the hills. So that was really part of the same movement as well. Fighting for access, being allowed eventually access. And then the national parks being created, which give protection to that landscape from encroachment and development. So yeah, all part of that same movement, and really still those same pressures today, and the same feeling inside when people want to get out and access footpaths, networks, places they can get from A to B or do a circular walk, enjoy the views. Nature cure.
One of the people who was a big voice in the mass trespass campaign was Owain McCall, the singer-songwriter, and he wrote a song called The Manchester Rambler. And I imagine that many of you listening might have moved from Manchester, or maybe travel in from Manchester to come and walk this particular patch. And in the second line of his song, The Manchester Rambler, he does say that he slept up on Crowden. So he walked through these areas, passing through to Bleaklow, to Kinder Scout. He mentions these places, that many of us know, and that was back in the 1930s. So we've put a pin on the map, actually, by Crowden, so you can kind of go and listen to that song via the YouTube video if you wish to familiarise yourself with this stuff. So I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that people have kind of been talking about this patch and its many different guises over the last 200 years. But I suppose what I find interesting is, by your book and your boundary walk, it's encouraging people that maybe might normally go over to Bakewell, to Castleton, to come over this way, to come and enjoy this, and recognising that the people who come from Manchester will also appreciate here too. We're just going to take a right turn, and now this is a really interesting point for people who know this bit. We've got, I think it's called a weir, which kind of follows the straight line of the water. It's like a steep embankment, and there's a kind of ramp up the side. At the other end you'll hear the water rushing down where there's a gauge basin. As I mentioned, it's a big circular thing where water normally shoots up on certain days, which is beautiful. But we can see here, as on the right, there is also a little sign that says Friends of the Peak District Boundary Walk. But interesting, if you want to geek out and get excited about an OS map, then you'll realise that actually the pink path of the actual Peak District boundary goes straight on down towards New Road and where the bridge is towards Tintwistle, and up a very steep road called Bank Lane, not necessarily the way that we're walking. But anyway, this is the prettier version, I think, and it's away from the road. I guess that's why this little bit kind of goes this way. And a really popular place that so many people walk. In coming episodes, I'm going to be talking to Kate Raine from Glossop Heritage Trust, and she's going to talk about the fact that all the reservoirs are called different names after local mill owners. So the Bottoms, the side Bottoms, the people who used to run Bridge Mill and Waterside Mill to our left, where I say the new road is, and the bridge towards Tintwistle. Amazing, massive fire happened, which pretty much was the end of Bridge Mill, which was a fascinating story I read about. So we'll get into some of the history of the mills and what all these different places were. But see, one of the things that I've really enjoyed actually kind of looking at boundaries is I've become an Ordnance Survey map geek. I had never read a map before in my life till about a year and a half ago. I didn't know. To me, it just looked really like kind of quite confusing. But yeah, it's just, once you actually get quite geeky with a map in places like this, it's amazing, and the different circular marks and things. So it's almost like when I've kind of seen a walk that I can do, or an Ethel, hill, I'm looking further to say, well, what else is there on the way? And I've been really, I think what I like about your particular boundary is that there is no kind of place that you're going to, say like an Ethel, where you've ticked it off and completed it, because it's a continuous journey. So there's always something different. So you could do all of these stages. I mean, you could do here stage 4 like 4 or 5 times a year, and it'd be completely different times of the day. The moon it normally just appears just to our right, and it reflects over the whole of the reservoir. On a full moon, it's amazing. But that idea of there isn't a place to kind of complete in that sense is an interesting concept.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, you're right about the maps. They're a bit of a code, aren't they? They're full of symbols, they're full of abbreviations, and they can be hard to decipher. And I think that's why it's so important that on the ground, when you're, when we're promoting walking, or we're hoping people can easily get outdoors, that things are accessible, that things are signposted well, and that there's a balance around that as well. So it's not sort of over signposted, but people know that they're going, on a safe and accessible route. But then, so the boundary walk itself, any walk is more than just what is on the ground and what's underneath your feet. There's all of the things around you, like you've talked about the heritage. We can see all the workings of, where the water flows out of Bottoms Reservoir, and all of the industry that would have been around powered by the water, which is really interesting. So there's lots in the book which gives a bit of added interest for people that do want to delve a little bit deeper into, what is around them. But it is about the journey. It's about, they tend to be linear walks. So you're starting in one place, you're moving through a landscape, you're moving through communities, and ending up at the end of that walk, and then it joins on to somewhere else. So it does seem to, you get pulled in, you get a feeling of, I'm going somewhere, this is leading somewhere, and what can I see along the way? So it is really interesting. That's how I feel. And I, we're doing a micro walk today, a very short walk, which is great, and it's nice to take it at a slower pace as well. But I already, I've only completed about 5 stages of the whole walk, but I want to do the rest. Time is a limiting factor, but it might take me a year or more, probably more. But, you know, I'd like to get around, and I'm fortunate to have the means, you know, to get around and explore these areas. But just for me, where I'm from, this is very new to me, this part of the Peak District, so it's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, you can start to hear the water now, so you know that we're reaching the valve house, which has a wonderful sign on the front of it, which I believe, having seen on many different forums, that it's got like a coat of arms engraved in stone on the front of it, and they believe it's the Manchester Corporation Waterworks coat of arms.
Right.
So we were trying to work out whose it was, and it seems to be that is the case. I'll hopefully find that out later on in the series, but not a lot of water coming down today. And interestingly, I mean, it'd be fascinating if I get to talk to some of the water engineers in this particular area, but I understand that water flows to the left, and then we've got the reservoir, and there's a balance here that not all of the reservoirs here are for drinking water for Manchester and beyond. Some of them are actually to replenish the River Etherow as it continues its journey. So we'll just head over the other side and gaze over to the gauge basin, and you can probably hear there's a bit more water there, but it's very quiet here. You know, normally it can really be, you know, a hive of activity. When it's shooting in the sky, the gauge basin, you soon know about it, and we would not be able to have a conversation stood here, put it that way.
Yeah.
It's so loud.
So quite peaceful today.
So if you do stage 4 and you're walking past this, just have a look, take a photo if you see the gauge basin in action. So we're going to come to the end of today's episode, and we're finishing right by some signage, and then our plan is to go and get the feeling back in our hands by finishing up with a Pixie's Coffee, which is at the top of New Road. So if you are not from this area, I highly recommend checking out their cakes. Had to unfollow them on Instagram because my waistline can't cope with it. It's too dangerous. But we're going to finish at this particular sign. There are signs here. I think just up a little set of steps there is where our path for stage 4 continues. But here it says the Trans-Pennine Trail West, the Pennine Bridleway, Trans-Pennine West East, Pennine Bridleway. But we're walking through some of the steps. There's a zigzaggy path, and we'll finish at one of the green circles. Oh, there's a little dog coming towards my face. Almost got a cameo. Where is it? Oh, it's down here. Sorry, we've got to go down a little bit. Down a little zigzag path, which it says in the book. We're going to finish. Hopefully, if you're listening, you can possibly find this little circle too. The fence has slightly just fallen over, but there is the green circle, which tells you're on the right path, which says Friends of the Peak District Boundary Walk.
Great stuff. Slightly fallen fence post there, but at least the signage is still there, and that's obviously something that is an ongoing challenge for us. Keeping the signage in place, helping people find the way on these wonderful little corners of paradise. That's how it feels to me today. It's great.
Well, it's been great to chat with you, Cassa, and thank you for bringing your book along, for helping us do this little, you know, kind of micro walk and exploring, you know, through different perspective of how we can kind of, you know, many of us are walking through this area all the time, but just knowing that we are walking the boundary, and maybe in the future we start to appreciate this through different eyes.
Thanks very much, Claire. Yeah, hopefully people do have a little bit of an awareness of the national park, and this is a little corner of it that can be explored, and you can keep going and going, and if you want you can get on the Pennine Way here, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Well, we'll put a link to the boundary walk on the CPRE website to this episode. Go and explore that, and come and engage with us on longdendaletales.co.uk. Be fascinated to hear your stories. Have a look and engage in some of the archive, the photos of this particular area, and enjoy engaging in some of the amazing stories. I'll be back with more stories tomorrow. Take care.